DDS Dobson-Smith, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, John.
It is a pleasure to be with you. You're joining us from Connecticut. I'm south of Salt Lake City in Utah. Today, we're going to be talking about specific steps for HR and people ops leadership to create an experience and culture of belonging within organizations. And I think this is always an important topic. This is one I feel passionate about. I'm super excited to pick your brain and get some of your insights. And I appreciate you taking time to share with me and my listeners today. As we get started, I wanted to share DDS's bio with everyone. DDS Dobson-Smith is the founder and CEO of the executive coaching consultancy Soul Trained and consults for big brands like Target, Spotify, and Udemy. As licensed psychotherapist and author of the #1 best-selling You Can Be Yourself Here, Your Pocket Guide to Creating Inclusive Workplaces by Using the Psychology of Belonging, he is a leader in the space and in thought leadership. And it's, again, pleasure to have you. Anything else you would like to share with me and my listeners by way of your background or personal context before we really dive on into the conversation?
No, let's dive on in, John, and see where we go.
Perfect. Well, why don't we start? I always like to ask how you found yourself in this space. You have a unique path, a unique journey. Everyone, very few people take a perfectly linear path. How did you find yourself in this space, doing this work in belonging and inclusion and just creating dynamic environments within organizations?
Yeah, you're right. It definitely isn't linear. I mean, I started out my career very, very early doors as being in academia and being a professor in further education in the UK. And I was at the time, I was the youngest college professor in the UK. And I remember a moment when I was handing back an assignment to a student who was born in the same day in the same year as my mum. The class that I was teaching was on public house operations because my undergrad is in hospitality management. I'm handing this guy back this assignment, and he's the same age as my parents. He's had a pub longer than I had been alive at the time, and I'd graded his assignment a C. And I remember looking him in the eyes and me going, who the heck am I right now? And I just didn't, we talk about imposter syndrome. Right in that moment, I was like, this does not feel good, and legitimately did not feel good. So I decided I'd go out into industry and get some miles on the clock and eventually go back to academia. And that started me on a search to find a career or a job that was as closely related to teaching as possible. And I ended up in HR, or as it was called back in the day, personnel management. And so from there on in, spent a 25-year-long career in HR, started as a generalist, and then kind of really went into learning and development, org psych, org development, and which I had a 25-year career up to board and C-suite level. But it was in the learning and development space where I first got into coaching and realized that as a coach, I can only help people to a certain degree, right? And coaching has a very future focused, and a lot of the time in coaching was bumping up against some issues that really required therapy. And I was like, well, maybe I'll go and learn to be a therapist. And so off I went and certified as a therapist and had a private practice in the UK. Moved to the US nearly 10 years ago. Only for a 2-year assignment. 2's led to 3 to 4. We got a green card, putting down roots. And I was like, I feel like I want to practice again as a psychotherapist. And it wasn't such an easy job to transfer my credentials as a therapist from the UK into the US. So I went back to school and I did a 3-year master's in integral counseling psychology. And as part of that program, I did a research paper into the psychological experience of belonging and how it impacts workplace performance, and I had an interest in that because my career had been in HR really about creating workplaces where people could be themselves and climates where people could be themselves. Because my theory is when you can be yourself at work, the psychological energy that would otherwise be taken up trying to cover, code switch, be a different version of yourself is unleashed and is available for, innovation, creativity, relationships, work. So this academic paper popped out, and it was called "You Can Be Yourself Here." And I was like, this needs to be out there in the world. And of course, an academic paper does not make for interesting reading. So I want the listeners to know that it is not an academic paper in a book. It has been peppered with, humor and vulnerability and other people's stories and practical real life examples of what organizations and leaders within organizations can do to create a climate of belonging and why they would want to do that anyway.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That is fascinating. And it sounds like we share many aspects to our origin stories.
Oh, really?
Long-time listeners of the podcast will know, and I don't want to repeat myself, and this isn't about me, but I have a PhD in sociology. So I'm a professor. I do consulting work as well as things like this on the side. And several years ago, I've published a ton in academic journals.
Yeah.
But like you said, that only reaches so many people.
It does.
And so I made the conscious choice. I've always done. I ended up in the HR training and development, leadership development space. It sounds like for the same reasons you did, and so I've always been involved in the practitioner space that way. But all my writing was academic, and I made the conscious decision a few years ago to move towards the scholar practitioner kind of orientation and make things, not necessarily try to become a thought leader, but just try to share things in a way that is going to be usable by the average person and digestible and accessible. Right. And so that's where this podcast came from. That's where a lot of my recent books and articles have come from. And it's been a fun journey. I still do the academic stuff. I still teach, I still do academic research, but I find this to be really enjoyable, and it informs my teaching in the university space. Right. And my research, of course, influences, what I do in the practitioner space. So it's a win-win all the way around.
Yeah, you and I share a lot in common. I'm just about to start my PhD in human sexuality, and I did go back into academia, and I'm adjunct faculty at a college on the West Coast, teaching grad students to become therapists. So yeah,
wonderful.
Full circle.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, with that common ground established, we two peas in the pod. Right. Let's talk more specifically about some of the ideas in your book around specifically what HR and people ops leaders, really any leader in an organization, can do as they're trying to establish that psychologically safe environment, culture, and really just a place where people can belong. We talk a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion, all of which are super important. But if you don't get past that to belonging, I'm not sure you actually get the full impacts, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing I want to say, and I know you qualified any leaders, I really want to say that diversity, inclusion, and belonging and equity is not the job of HR and people ops. And I think the organizations that fail in this area are the organizations that believe it is somebody else's job to do this stuff. HR and people ops, from my perspective, are specialists, are enablers, are thought leaders. But if this topic doesn't become on the agenda of everybody that takes a seat of power in an organization, then the organization is pissing in the wind, quite frankly. And so the book does lay out a ton of things that are in the HR world around how to create diversity in an organization. And I talk about diversity being a fact. You either do or do not have diversity and representation in an organization. And then I talk about inclusion as being a behavior, and organizational behavior in terms of the policies, platforms, and protocols that an organization uses to go about its business, but also the behavior of its people. And I've long time said that the behavior, that a climate of an organization is going to be shaped by the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate in a leader. And so therefore, this behavior of inclusion, once you've got diversity and you've recruited diversity and you've nurtured diversity and all of that sort of stuff, if the organization and its leaders don't behave in inclusive ways, you're not going to reach that space of belonging, which I talk about in the book as being an experience. You experience belonging when there is the presence of psychological safety, which is the experience that you have when it's not expensive to be yourself. So the book is peppered with practical tools and resources, but when it comes down to it, the difference that will make the difference, the thing that will break the bank, is the behavior of the leaders in an organization. And if we have people sitting in seats of power that are doing DEI because they know they're supposed to, versus doing DEI and being DEI because of the benefits that it brings not only to the organization but to society in general. It's the organizations that understand the deep economics of this and that will succeed in this space.
Yeah, you can't just give lip service to it. It's not just something for a PR campaign or for a slogan or for a nice poster on the wall.
Right.
Having a mission and value statements, those are good, but you got to get beyond that. And in this day and age, most organizations recognize that their consumers expect them to, be socially aware and at least surface level inclusive, but is it actually embedded into the organization? Are those values actually integrated throughout the policies, practices, procedures? Right. Does it actually come out in the lived leadership style and experience of leaders throughout the organization, right? On a regular basis, on a daily basis. And if you're just giving lip service to it, but then you're making decisions behind closed doors and those in the C-suite that undermine that value, then clearly people are going to recognize it for what it is. And it's just a facade. And so we have to walk the walk, we have to model it. And only then can we start to really permeate this general attitude, this mindset and culture towards belonging. And you've already mentioned, the economic benefits, the bottom line, ROI of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And that is clearly demonstrated in so much research. I've done some of that research myself. It's clearly demonstrated. And so while the people case, I would hope that the human element, the people case would be enough. The reality is there's a very clear business case and economic case, ROI, for these behaviors, for these actions. And so it's really, quite frankly, stupid for organizations and leaders who resist it. And so then the question becomes, well, why do so many resist it? Because that's been my experience, is the vast majority of organizations that are doing DEI and belonging work, it's still pretty darn surface level. And even if their intentions are good, even if they have aspirational goals in the space, they're not anywhere close to actually creating an environment of belonging.
Yeah, I mean, I was reading, why, so the business case is clear, and we see that because you just look around and see all of these brands who are, I was reading an article today about woke washing. And here are these brands, last year they'll slap a black square on their Instagram feed and talk about Black Lives Matter. But as soon as you peer inside and look under the hood, there is no Black person in a seat of power. There is no ARGs supporting the Black, Brown, Indigenous or Asian communities. We're June 2nd, we're 2 days into Pride Month. And just look at all of the brands out there that have slapped a rainbow on their logo. And I wonder how many how many brands actually have policies and practices that actively support the queer community, whether that's trans people being supported on their medical and social transition in work, or inclusive parental policies, or whatever it is, right? Like this movement has become capitalized because brands know that they are going to make money from it. And yet, when you look under the hood and brands don't do the hard miles, right? And why don't they do it? Well, I think because most people are scared of being wrong. And in order to do well in this space of belonging and diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to be prepared to be wrong. We have to be prepared to have conversations and tread on people's toes and make mistakes and fall over and cause offense and learn from that. But because we're so scared of being shamed or blamed, or because we're so scared of, being, not being quote unquote politically correct, whatever that means, we decide instead to not have the conversations, which just serves to keep us where we are. It keeps us stuck in our current place, which is a society that promotes and favors anyone that is white, straight, cisgender, male, or non-disabled.
Yeah, well said, well said. And I was walking through Target just yesterday. So June 1st, I'm walking through Target with a friend who happens to be bisexual. And she is just pointing out some of the brand, like you were talking about, some of the branding, rainbows and things like that. And she was pointing out some of the clothing that happened to have like rainbows on it, for Pride Month. And she's like, on the one hand, I'm happy that this is happening. I'm happy that it's more visual for people. On the other hand, who would wear that? Like she was making the comment, like, did they actually talk to anybody who's from that community to try to get input as to, what would make sense for Target to put their best foot forward. Now, I actually don't know anything about Target and their policies and practices around LGBTQ+ inclusivity. Maybe they're great, but in this instance, her comment was, so many organizations just simply don't actually ask the people within their organizations that could actually inform them and help them better understand what a culture and environment of belonging or inclusivity would be. What if you're in the product space, what types of products and services would actually be of value and add to the dialogue and the conversation rather than just strictly commercialize it, right? And that was kind of her critique of Target, and I think it was a very valid one. It's been evident in other places that I've seen, and it's something you just highlighted in what you said. So again, having aspirational values that we're striving for is great, and we may not be there yet, and nobody expects you to be perfect, but you got to engage in the space, and then you have to actually listen to the people who are from those populations. On the other side of that spectrum, so maybe a company that has good intentions but isn't listening in the right way, isn't engaging people from those disadvantaged populations in the right way. To the other extreme, where you see an organization that has really good intentions, and they really want to hear those voices. They want to put people from those populations from within their employee group in those seats of power, right? And I saw this recently with an organization I was working with. They've had a really hard time in the gender space with just misogyny, sexism, and really imbalanced hiring practices. So, just hugely imbalanced, 80% men instead, no gender balance. And so they made the decision that every single hiring committee for a new position had to be chaired by a female. And on the one hand, I think that sounds great because they've been perpetuating this problem for so long, and you got to do something to disrupt it. On the other hand, again, only 20% of the only 20% in the organization are female, and now they have to chair every single search committee. Like, now we're just burdening and piling on to this population that's just going to have to do more and more work. and so that's not the answer either, right? And so we have to engage in the space. We have to have the dialogue. We have to create and maintain policies, practices, and procedures that promote equity and can create that safe environment. But man, we got to both listen and not overly burden people from those populations. Thoughts on how to navigate that?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's complex, right? So I understand the positive intention behind what that organization did, but I remember when I was a kid watching Tom and Jerry cartoons, and there was a moment when I think Jerry had flooded the washing machine, and Tom had shut the door to the washing machine room, and then the water started spurting out of the keyhole, and he put a pour there, and then water was starting out, then he put another pour up there, and then water was, so he put another pour. And that's the thing, like you have to take an holistic approach to this. You can't just solve spot problems, because we live in a web of systems that have been set up in a certain way. So positive intention behind having a female chair the recruitment committee, but then basically it's saying, okay, it's over to you. It's your problem to solve, women, right? Like, which is quite frankly not okay. And
yes.
So I think you need to start earlier than that, and you need to think about who's designing the job descriptions, who's designing the structure of the organization, and is that balanced in terms of perspectives on how to create an organization and how to set up a job, because it could be inherently biased towards a certain population. Once you've done your job architecture and you've made sure that the biases have been kind of worked out of that, then you go into your recruitment practices. Are you advertising jobs in a place where your audience are going to consume those jobs? Or are you always advertising at, historically white colleges? Or are you advertising only on LinkedIn? Or are you going to places where parents, mothers, queer people, Black people, Asian people might see the ad and therefore apply? And then when they do apply, are you taking action to make sure that names are removed from resumes in order to remove name bias or certain information, so that when it goes through the first sift, those biases again are mitigated, so that when it does get to when it does get to an interview, have you got a balanced candidate list or a short list, or even a long list that you have arrived at that has had the natural biases mitigated? So you got to start way before the actual interview if you want to recruit diversity into the organization.
Yeah, very well said. And undergirding all of this, is really, well, it's both a foundation and an outcome. So it's going to be self-reinforcing, but we have to create a psychologically safe environment where there's mutual accountability and trust, right? So from that comes the foundation of these policies, practices, procedures that can help to increase the diversity, equity, and inclusion elements. And it's a byproduct of that you're just going to get more and more of it to have that sense of belonging within the organization. So it is complex. We got to work on it. Let's have the conversations. Let's keep it moving forward. I'm committed to it, and I know we can move the needle. I know we can actually make rapid progress if we just continue to engage. Well, DDS, it has been a pleasure. I note the time. I have to let you skip here in just a minute. Before we close, though, I just wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can connect with you and find out more about your work, and then any final word you might have on the topic for today.
Yeah, thank you. So feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, DDS Dobson-Smith. You can also head over to SoulTrain's website, which is www.soultrained.com. You'll find a page on there called Shift Happens, which is jam-packed full of articles, blogs, and podcasts. There's also a couple of pages on there where you can order my current book, You Can Be Yourself Here, and also preview the up-and-coming book, which is published in September, called Leadership is a Behavior, Not a Title.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I encourage listeners to reach out, get connected, find out more about what DDS can do for you, check out his books. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.